So this is going to be a bit of a departure from my usual YouTube videos where I just talk about Jiu-Jitsu and Jiu-Jitsu technique. Instead, I'm going to talk a little bit about photography, and specifically photography for Jiu-Jitsu. So around 2017, I wanted to step up our social media game, which meant getting better photos of people doing Jiu-Jitsu. Unfortunately, all our photos were just group against the wall, awkward shaka, end of an evening photos that every gym takes. And those aren't interesting for people who don't do Jiu-Jitsu. They're barely interesting for the people who do Jiu-Jitsu. So I want to get people rolling. Unfortunately, that's really hard. And I went looking for information on how people take Jiu-Jitsu photos from competitions, etc. And there wasn't really that much information out there. So I taught myself photography for the past 7 years, 8 years, whatever it's been. And this is going to be what I know now, so hopefully give you a head start. I'm not saying I'm a good photographer. I'm very average at best. But hopefully the information in this video will give you the head start that I didn't have, so you can go out there and get the right kit and take some great Jiu-Jitsu photos. If you stick around to the end, I'll also talk a little bit about how to create a video streaming channel of people rolling in your gym. So the main enemy of Jiu-Jitsu photography is light, and the fact there is very little of it in most gyms. And what we do is quite a fast-moving sport, which means that getting decent, sharp photos on a phone is almost impossible, which means you're going to have to invest in a camera, one that you can change the lens on, and they're called DSLR cameras or mirrorless cameras. Either way, you need to be able to change the lens on your camera. I started with a Canon 1300D. I'm now up to a Canon RP. I'll link all my equipment in the description of this video. That's not the important part. What you're looking for is the fact that you can change the lens on your camera, and you need something called a fast lens. The main things that are going to affect the light coming into your camera are the shutter speed, the aperture, which is measured in f-stops, and the ISO number. So firstly, the shutter speed, that's what sits behind your lens and opens and closes and lets light onto the sensor of the camera. The faster that is, the less light that comes in. The slower that is, the more light comes in, but the more chance the image will be blurry. So because of how fast we roll in Jiu-Jitsu, you're looking for roughly between 1/500 to 1,000th of a second for your shutter speed to get that nice crisp photo. The second you need to look at is the aperture, and that'll be on the lens when you buy it. It'll have a F number, and the lowest F number is the width of the aperture. It's kind of inverted. So the lower the number, the wider the aperture. The smaller the number, the smaller the aperture. And you want a nice big wide iris to let as much light in as possible. So I usually use f 1.4, 1.8, quite wide. Anything above 2.8, you're going to have a hard time taking photos. And finally, they have the ISO number, and that's kind of the volume of the sensor, as it were. And the higher the volume, the more static you're probably going to let into that image. And I'll explain a bit more of that throughout this video. So currently we're looking at shutter speed, and it's set to 1,000th of a second. And we're going to slow it down. And as you can see, it's letting more light in, but that's going to cause the image to get more blurry. The next thing we're going to look at is the aperture, which currently is set to 1.8. The benefit of having a wider aperture, so down at 1.8, 1.4, is it is going to allow us to get more light onto the sensor. So that can allow us to get a better shutter speed. The other side is it's going to create that really cool blurry background. So the front of your image, the main subject of your image, is going to be in focus and sharp. And what's behind in the background is going to be really blurry, and it's going to create that differentiation between what the person should be looking at and what is out of focus and isn't important for this image. And finally, what we're going to look at is the ISO number. And a higher ISO allows us to get more light in the image as well. We're not letting more light onto the sensor, it's increasing the volume or the sensitivity of the sensor. The problem with that is that also increases the noise and the grain. So when you come to look at the image, it can look quite grainy and quite rubbish. I mean, it is possible to save it in post-production through apps such as Adobe Lightroom. You want to use as little ISO as possible to get your proper exposure. I would say look at something called exposing to the right, which is where you make the image ever so slightly brighter than it has to be. So when it has that little exposure in the middle, you're just moving ever so slightly to the right. So then when you darken it in post-production, you actually hide some of the noise. It's something I've only learned recently, and it's saved so many images. Now we're going to look at actually how to focus the camera. And so usually you have something called like one shot or something. We're actually going to move over to something called servo. So I'm going to move onto the menu here and then go from one shot to AI focus and then over to servo mode. And that's going to use the autofocusing of the camera to keep track of a moving subject. If I'm in one shot, it's going to stay exactly where it is. But I'm going to put it in servo and put it in the whole area. So then if I've got people rolling, it's going to focus on those people. Even if they move around, it's going to refocus for me. And finally, we're going to look at the image quality. So I prefer shooting in RAW. What that means is when the light hits the sensor, it usually goes through to the processing capabilities of the camera, and that gives you what the camera thinks, and that's a JPEG, which you can just go use straight off the bat. They're good enough for when you're first starting out. But when you want to try and save certain details, it's easier to shoot in RAW and then go into a processing software like Adobe Lightroom, and it doesn't chuck away any of the details of what was seen on the sensor. So you can pull back some shadows or parts of the image that you may have lost compared to just using a JPEG, which when you're shooting inside a gym and light is all over the place, it's much easier to rescue a photo with RAW than it is in JPEG, where you've lost up to 80% of the data that the sensor originally saw. And now we're actually going to take a photo, and this is probably the most important part of this entire video, and that is get down level with the people who are rolling. The goal is to try and create a 3D image with a specific foreground and background. If I am taking the picture from up above, looking down at the people who are rolling, the floor now becomes the background, and that's not a very big 3D image. It also makes the people look small. Yet if I'm taking the picture from their height, the rest of the room becomes the background, and it makes them look bigger. It makes them look more imposing and more impressive. So even if you can only use your mobile phone, take lots of photos and just get down level with the people and just keep snapping. And even then, you're going to have more interesting photos than people who take them from up top looking down. So as a basic recap, what you're looking for then is a kind of camera that you can change the lens on, so a mirrorless or DSLR camera. You want a fast lens, which means it has a low f number, so 1.4, 1.6, 1.8. Focal length, which you haven't talked about, you're looking for anywhere between 35 to 50 as your first kind of lens. There's a lens called a Nifty 50, which are super cheap. They've usually got a great f number on them. So one of the first lenses I used, it was a 50mm 1.4 on my Canon 1300. And I used that for years and I got great photos out of it. So a 50 is going to be a good starter lens for anyone. And you won't really need much more if you're just taking photos inside the gym. Keep that shutter speed from 1/500 to 1/1000th of a second. It's going to make that shot nice and crisp for you. You're not going to get much motion blur, especially when people are moving around. You will find that will make your image darker, which is going to mean you're going to have to make sure your aperture is nice and wide. So like I say, if you can get a 1.4, 1.6, you're going to get a lot more light in, and it's going to create that really nice blurry background and make the foreground really pop out. Then you're going to have to adjust ISO. You are going to have to ramp it up, which is going to increase noise. But when you have the little exposure meter at the bottom of your screen, make it so it's just above the middle to the right. And that means that then when you darken it in post-production, you're going to hide more noise than, say, if you're to do an image that had good exposure and then try and brighten it, you will bring a lot of those noise out in the dark areas, which does kind of destroy the image. And most importantly, get down low. You want to create that background. You're turning a 3D situation into a 2D image. So the second that you start taking pictures from up high, looking down on people, you are making them look small, but at the same time, the floor now becomes the background, and it's not an interesting background. Get level, get straight with the people you are taking photos of, get down to their height, look across, and the rest of the room becomes the background. And that's going to make your images really interesting. And as I said as a bonus tip, I then got hold of a GoPro. And one thing with GoPro is it'll allow you to live stream directly to YouTube through your phone. And so one thing that we do for our rolling is I set up a GoPro, I set the hotspot up on my phone so I can then stream Wi-Fi to the GoPro. I think you have to have 50 subscribers on your channel to be able to do it. But we've been using it as a slam cam for the past year now. And it's meant that every time we go rolling, people can watch back their rolls. I don't have to upload huge files onto YouTube, which you imagine if you were to record an hour's worth of rolling. And sometimes we roll for 2 hours. It can absolutely fill a memory card. But if it's live streaming, it's no issues whatsoever. It's a great thing about GoPro and the GoPro Quick app. One thing that you may have issues with if you are playing music whilst you're rolling, it will set off YouTube's copyright. So it will just disable the video. To get around that, there's something called a media mod where you can plug in like a dead microphone, like a dummy microphone. And that will mean that it completely mutes the audio, so you won't have that issue. It's been very popular in my gym. They now want to try and replicate it across the affiliates I have. So we've got about 5 gyms, and everyone wants to now do this across all the gyms because it does feedback really well from all the students. They love watching the sessions afterwards. And because it's live streamed, as soon as I click finish, I can then go straight onto the YouTube, get the link, and just give that to all the students. Pretty much instantly it's ready. And that can be like, a 2-hour video, and they can just go in and timestamp situations, send them back to me and go, yo, Chris, what happened here? And I can break it down for them. So as a bonus tip, if you're looking at creating kind of a useful, wide-angled streaming platform, GoPro works really well. You have to have 50 subscribers for it to allow streaming through to YouTube. But I hope you found this video on Jiu-Jitsu photography interesting. Make sure if you find anything useful here, tag me in the photos. I'd love to see what you do.